And there's a bit of a gray area with everyone's understanding for exactly when Shadowless cards were printed,
Hmm.
versus the first edition copy. So when you look at a Shadowless card, it is actually identical in every single way to the first edition copies, with the exception of that stamp. And then the stamp itself, there's the thick stamp and the thin stamp. So my understanding of Shadowless in perspective to the first edition cards is that actually every single first edition card started off as a shadowless, like, okay, it was printed in a shadowless sheet without any stamps of any kind. And the actual stamping process, they selected certain sheets and they were then, aligned on some other secondary printing process, and then the stamp was physically added. So if from that perspective, like the only reason why this is not a first edition, PSA 10 Charizard is literally because that sheet was physically, not selected for maybe a QC reason. Maybe the alignment of the front and the back of the sheets wasn't really strongly aligned or anything like that, or print lines. There's a lot of actually common printing errors that you see in shadowless cards that make you wonder, wow, did these shadowless sheets just like fail the QC process? And they were like, we cannot stamp these cards with a first edition symbol. Like literally, like they have so many streaks and print lines, or the front of the card will be it'll be well centered, but the back of the card, it'll be completely misaligned when they go to cut it. So from what I've seen from uncut sheets of both the first edition uncut sheets and the shadowless uncut sheets, they're absolutely identical in every way. The actual pattern of the individual monsters on the sheet, as well as the actual barcodes, the actual text on the barcodes, shadowless uncut sheets, the few that I've seen actually label them as first edition sheets.
Oh,
So what that means is like, wow, this is actually a sheet that's shadowless. It just doesn't have the first edition symbol on it. So, okay, so what does that then tell you about shadowless? I think they overprinted shadowless in some way, like, or rather, they printed that original artwork on shadowless sheets, and then they selected a subset of that to be eventually printed, with the first edition symbol. And now the color variations is actually a really cool part of this story. Um, for the most part, the first edition hollows actually have a very similar cardstock and a very similar like printing, like the colors that they use. There's not a hell of a lot of variance between first edition cards, even between first edition thin stamp and thick stamp. The cardstock is usually more of a yellow border all the way around, and the actual ink itself is very similar. Now with Shadowless, there's actually huge variation in everything from the cardstock used. Which, when I say cardstock, I'm talking about the difference between, say, like a really light yellow border,
hmm.
so the actual like cardstock that everything was printed on, versus one that's a much darker orange. And then within, I mean, I could show you like 5 or 6 of these shadowless Blastoise, all of which have a very different like bluish color and tint to the everything from the hollow itself to the ink used. And so, in my perspective, I think a lot of the shadowless cards, or at least a lot of the shadowless production, it just had a lot of variance, where it actually could have been when they were fine tuning the printing process. I think there was actually a lot of variance with just how much ink or what ink they were using and the different cardstock that they were using. So, I mean, it's not a secret actually that the print production of first edition, I mean, right out of the pack, is tremendously better than the cards that you would pull from a shadowless pack.
Hmm.
And so I very much think that the first edition cards were almost preferentially selected to receive that first edition symbol. And the way it was cut, the centering on the front and back is often a lot better than shadowless. And yeah, so I mean, there's definitely a story there. There's more research that actually should be done, or maybe more information that should be talked about. Because a lot of people, I think, have this misconception that all of the first edition cards were printed and then they were sold maybe January 1st, 1999. And then somewhere in like March or April, they fired up the printing presses and then they started printing Shadowless cards. It's completely wrong. Like first edition and Shadowless were printed at the exact same time. They were, eventually cut and then, sleeved into the first edition packs and the Shadowless, the unlimited packs rather, at the exact same time. And they hit the store front at the exact same time. There's no, to my knowledge, there's no time gap between when first edition and Shadowless was produced, cut, packaged, shipped, and sold in stores. It was the exact same time. You don't see that transition into like the normal unlimited, like just with the shadowed unlimited.
Hmm.
That did take time. This is a different printing process. It's a different artwork. They used a different card stock. They were cut, packaged into different artwork like packs and everything. That itself is a different print production or print run. The Shadowless and first edition are pretty much identical, with the exception of that first edition symbol. And when I say identical, I mean in terms of everything from when it was printed to when it was released to when it was sold to when people were opening. It was the first. Those were the first cards to market. Those were the original 1999 base set Pokemon cards. And yes, there's a difference between thick stamp, there's a difference between thin stamp, and there's a difference between Shadowless. But that difference is pretty marginal in my opinion. Like
And the difference is only on that stamp.
And exactly. And are we ever going to know definitively? Like it would be great if we had a production manager from the WotC factory that said, "Hey, you know what? We selected the top, I don't know, 1,000 sheets from the entire Shadowless bulk, production run. And those top 1,000 sheets received the first edition stamp. And somewhere they switched from a thick stamp to a thin stamp. And then all the extra Shadowless sheets, they didn't stamp at all. They just cut them and released them as unlimited." That's kind of how I see like everything shaking out with the first edition and Shadowless. So in my opinion, like there has been a long misconception that Shadowless is somehow this massive secondary run. And to my knowledge, I don't. There's nothing that tells me that it was printed and later produced versus the first edition.
Yeah, it can't be.
And
With the pop reports, it simply can't be.
Exactly. And actually, that's a good point. If you look at the total number of cards graded in first edition and Shadowless, it's actually very similar. So like, when you look and see that, there's been, I don't know, 4,000 first edition Charizards graded, and there's been 4,000 Shadowless Charizards graded. Well, you assume that, X amount of cards were either destroyed, lost, or still ungraded. But the fact that similar numbers have actually been graded, it lends itself to believe that maybe there's an equal number of first edition and Shadowless cards out there. And yeah, they just took a subset of the total number of cards printed and they stamped that subset with that, the first edition symbol.
Right, and that conversation,
Okay.
that theory of
I'm
yours,
sure
that theory of yours with the QC checks, that makes sense too with the pop report. So there's a
really
lot of
does.
connecting
Actually,
pieces here. Yeah.
so Shadowless cards right out of the pack, I can tell you from a lot of people that have done box breaks that have graded these pack fresh Shadowless cards, you're talking about like, you're lucky if it's a mint card that might score an 8 or a 9. I mean, with the sheer number of print lines and misalignment, especially with the front and or back of Shadowless cards, they grade so poorly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reason why you actually see a massive, scarcity to the Shadowless 10s, especially in a card like the Chansey. I mean, this card is not an easy grade.